After the Civil War ended in 1865, enslaved blacks in America received their freedom. Charleston, South Carolina became known for its genteel society and rich history. However, as the years passed, during and after the Reconstruction period, blacks in southern cities such as Charleston found that there were still certain aspects of freedom they had not yet received. Civil rights are the rights that all citizens should enjoy as a matter of law in a democracy. In order to make permanent transformations in the laws and culture, members of the black population in Charleston stood up for their rights. Taking a stand for equality in both political and economic arenas was an integral part of the civil rights movement in Charleston. While blacks struggled to gain political power, whites manipulated political power to stop advancement for blacks. Despite federal legislation put into place giving blacks the right to vote, poll taxes, literacy tests, and understanding clauses were used to help ensure that blacks would have little or no voting power.
You had to take a literacy test to prove that you wanted to vote. You had to pay a poll tax, and the amount of that tax varied depending upon what color you were. The literacy test was really the most interesting. I went with one of my older aunts when she renewed her voter registration, and there were two folks in line. A white lady was ahead of her, and then she was in line. When the white lady went up to renew her voter registration, the literacy test was that day's Columbia newspaper. When my aunt went up to register, it was a portion of the state constitution. She had to interpret constitutional law in order to register to vote.
South Carolina Democrats attempted to make their party into a private club in which only whites could vote. However, blacks began to see that by obtaining a political voice, they could address basic civil rights issues such as desegregation in schools, on buses, and in other public areas, as well as elect officials who supported civil rights causes. Black Charlestonians such as Septima Clark and Esau Jenkins organized citizenship schools to assist blacks in learning to read and pass literacy tests. Much effort was put into registration drives, especially through black churches and neighborhoods.
The more people we got registered, it seemed like the more power that we had.
In January 1964, the 24th Amendment was ratified, which outlawed poll taxes, and the following year the Voting Rights Act was passed.
The Voting Rights Act made it possible to register to vote without going through so many hoops. Once that happened, you had a huge influx of African American voters.
Blacks worked diligently to gain their voting powers and then used these newfound powers to make meaningful changes. As these voting powers were used to address other civil rights issues, economic problems were still widespread. As civil rights activists turned their attention to address economic issues, substandard housing and employment opportunities were two of the major concerns. The majority of black Charlestonians were employed in low-wage positions and often living in dilapidated neighborhoods. Economic inequalities were evident in where blacks were hired, their pay, and the conditions of their employment. In the early 1950s, the median income for blacks was one-third that of whites. Many stores in the main downtown shopping area refused to hire black workers, despite the fact that many blacks shopped in those stores. The NAACP made use of the blacklist to single out these stores.
I had the sign on the hits and on myself. If we cannot work to the store, then we wouldn't buy anything from the store.
There were no blacks or colored or Negroes. It was Negroes at that time. And when I talked with management about the hiring of someone at the store, and he stated that you can't do that, said, before I do that, my grandson would be grown and maybe have children. That would never happen. And I left, I said, well, we'll see.
In 1963, a Charleston movement established a committee to suggest solutions to the city's race problems and demanded improved employment opportunities. After marches, sit-ins, and demonstrations, which some whites supported, a number of businesses agreed to desegregate. The city's white Catholic hierarchy gave strong support to the strikes representing the poor. Building on the momentum of the Poor People's March of 1968 in Charleston, the hospital workers' strike of 1969 was launched. Many blacks struggled financially and felt the civil rights movement had not impacted their daily lives. The strike's goals were for a pay increase for the workers and for a union to deal with grievances. The strike was organized by Mary Moultrie, a nurse's aide, and by a local activist, William Saunders.
One of the reasons that I and some others organized the hospital workers was because of the economics of it. We had already gained the rights to go to certain places, but couldn't really afford to go there.
More than 400 people, mainly poor black women, were on strike for over 100 days. Poor blacks and students were the biggest part of the demonstrators and were drawn to the cause with which they so readily identified. Showing their desire for respect, Adrena Johnson wrote from jail as a result of participating in the strike. We as a black people in South Carolina want to be recognized, not because of our race, but because we are human beings. Leaders in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, such as the recently widowed Mrs. Martin Luther King Jr., as well as Dr. King's successor, Dr. Ralph Abernathy, participated in some of the marches. Senator Robert Ford originally came to Charleston as a young man for the hospital strike. Organizational meetings were held at local churches. Due to demonstrations and violence, National Guardsmen were called in. Downtown businesses were boycotted, and Charleston stores lost around $15 million. Union organizer Dave White describes the situation to the Union president in New York. A new mood is being born in the black population. The fear has gone from large numbers of black people. They are ready for changes. They are willing to give their lives to bring about this change. The people realize this is not just a struggle to add a few more dollars to a paycheck, but that this is a movement of men and women who are determined that their children shall have a chance to be men and women.
The strike was over 100 days, and we marched and demonstrated, and eventually we won.
While the goals of a pay increase and a grievance procedure were reached, more importantly, as the Charleston Post put it, important lessons have been learned this summer. The most important is that of the growing power of elements of the community who have hitherto been relatively voiceless. This effort was a major milestone in uniting the black community across class lines and made the strong point that blacks were not happy with their status in the Charleston community. These stands were effective in making strides towards economic and political equality and had long-reaching positive effects. New black leaders emerged and voter registration among blacks rose significantly. In 1970, black candidates were elected to a public office in Charleston for the first time in the 20th century.
It was once said that what Dr. Martin Luther King did was expose Southerners of goodwill to their consciences. And when people like Ernestine Felder and Bill Saunders and others took stands, they made others think. Those stands are the reason that the economic and political opportunity was gained, which has made our community and our country a far better place.
The civil rights movement in Charleston was in many ways a battle that had to be fought in the minds of the citizens. Many traditions and Jim Crow customs had to be addressed. The issues involved in the political and economic arenas were deep-rooted and complex, and the sides were not always divided by race. As Cecil Williams said, "I have always thought of the ongoing struggle not as a conflict between black and white people, but rather a conflict between justice and injustice." Ordinary people took on leadership roles and made great sacrifices to take a stand for themselves, their neighbors, and their communities.
And whenever we marched from a church, we would all hold hands and pray, because we did not know whether or not we would ever return back to that church alive, or whether or not the church would even be there.
We each have a choice today how our actions will impact the future.
When you look at people who are selling drugs in our community, to me, that's going to the back of the bus. When you don't have people who are registered to vote, or people who are registered and don't vote, that, to me, is going to the back of the bus.
We need to stay involved in our communities and through the stands we take, try to make our world a better place.